The days that followed were calm, and for John, it felt like a weight had finally lifted off his shoulders. The shed was no longer a secret battleground, and the tension that had crept into his mornings was gone. Wow. Each time he stepped outside, now he felt a kind of relief. He knew the timer was doing its quiet work, and Karen could no longer drain his electricity without facing the consequences. Still, he kept his eyes open, curious to see how long it would take before she gave up. Completely. The signs were clear soon enough. Karen's golf cart began appearing less and less on the neighborhood roads. Before, she would zip around daily, visiting friends, making short trips, or simply cruising as though it was her pride and joy. Now, the cart often sat in her driveway, gathering dust. On some days, she was forced to walk. John even saw her, carrying grocery bags one afternoon, puffing slightly as she climbed her porch steps. Her cart was clearly giving her trouble, and John knew exactly why. Karen, however, never admitted anything. Not once did she come to him and confess that she had been using his outlet again, or that she was frustrated by the sudden lack of reliable charging. Instead, she kept up a front, complaining loudly to other neighbors about how her cart battery was getting old or how the charger seemed faulty. One evening, while John trimmed the bushes along his fence, he overheard her talking to a neighbor. "It just doesn't hold a charge anymore," she was saying, her voice laced with irritation. "I plug it in all night, and then the thing dies halfway to the store. I think it's time for a new battery, or maybe the whole cart is on its last legs." The neighbor murmured something sympathetic, and Karen sighed dramatically, shaking her head as though life had been terribly unfair to her. John had to bite back a chuckle. She was spinning a story, pretending the problem was mechanical when, in truth, the problem was her sneaky habit meeting a clever trick. He didn't feel guilty for smiling to himself. She had brought it on herself, and he hadn't done anything to damage her property, just protected his own. As the weeks passed, Karen's frustrations seemed to grow. John noticed how she sometimes walked around her yard muttering to herself, occasionally kicking at the tires of the golf cart in anger. Once, when he was working on his fence, she stormed past in a huff, her arms crossed tightly, not even glancing in his direction. It was clear she was annoyed, but she couldn't blame him openly without admitting what she had been doing. That, in itself, was a small victory. One Saturday morning, John was sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee when Karen came down the street, pushing her cart slowly by hand. It looked ridiculous, a grown woman dragging a golf cart like a stubborn mule butt. There she was, red-faced and struggling. When she noticed John watching, she gave a forced laugh. "Battery's dead again," she called out, trying to sound casual. "These things are so unreliable." John gave her a polite smile. "That's a shame. You might want to have it checked out." Karen waved dismissively and kept dragging the cart home. John sipped his coffee, the corners of his mouth twitching. Upward, he hadn't needed to say much. The situation spoke for itself. What struck John the most was how the whole neighborhood dynamic had shifted. Karen, once confident and carefree, now seemed irritated more often, her golf cart problem clearly weighing on her. Meanwhile, John felt lighter. He'd managed to protect his property without causing open conflict. There were no shouting matches, no police, no neighborhood gossip pointing at him. To everyone else, Karen simply had a faulty cart. Only John knew the full story. Over time, Karen seemed to accept defeat. John noticed that she stopped sneaking around at night. The shed door stayed closed, the outlet untouched. He began to relax again, enjoying his evenings without keeping one ear open for the hum of a charger. The timer stayed in place, still ready, but it became less about defense and more about peace of mind. He had regained control, and the shed once again felt like his safe personal space. One evening, as the sun was dipping low and the crickets began to sing, John sat outside and reflected on it all. At first, the situation had left him angry and unsettled. He couldn't understand how someone could so boldly invade his space and act as if it didn't matter. But now, looking back, he realized something important. Karen's behavior had taught him a lesson not about electricity, but about boundaries. He had always been the type to avoid conflict, to stay polite, even when people crossed the line. But sometimes politeness wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to stand firm in a quiet, clever way that couldn't be ignored. Karen never apologized, and John doubted she ever would. But that didn't matter anymore. Her silence, her frustration, and her abandoned golf cart were all the proof he needed that she had learned something. Even if she would never say it aloud. One afternoon, as he worked in his shed fixing a broken chair, he thought about the satisfaction of the whole plan. The timer had been such a simple tool, yet it had solved the problem without him raising his voice or damaging the fragile peace of the neighborhood. It was almost funny to him. Kieran thought she was clever sneaking around. But in the end, it was his quiet thinking that had outsmarted her. Sometimes he wondered if she suspected. Did she ever stop and think, maybe John did something to that outlet, or did she truly believe her cart was failing on its own? He would never know, but in a way, it was better that she stayed in the dark. The mystery probably made her more cautious, more hesitant to try anything like it again, as autumn rolled in. The air grew cooler, and the leaves began to scatter across the yards. John felt content. His electricity bills were back to normal. His shed was secure, and his evenings were peaceful once more. Whenever he passed by Karen, he greeted her politely, just as he always had. She, in return, managed a stiff nod or a half-hearted smile, but the easy boldness she once carried was gone. Life returned to normal, but with one small difference. John carried a quiet confidence now. He knew he could protect his space without losing his temper, without dragging others into his problems. He had found a way to handle things with both strength and subtlety. And in his heart, he knew that if Karen or anyone else tried something like that again, he would be ready. From then on, whenever he saw the unused golf cart sitting in her driveway, collecting dust, it reminded him of the small victory he had won. Not through anger, not through shouting, but through patience and cleverness. It was proof that sometimes the smartest battles are the ones fought silently, where the other person doesn't even realize they've already lost. John had always believed that sometimes the smartest solutions were the quietest ones. He didn't want to yell across fences or get into arguments that would never end. Karen had already shown that words didn't matter to her. She heard them. But she didn't listen. If he wanted peace, he needed to do something different, something that would speak louder than words but without him ever raising his voice. One afternoon, as he stood inside the shed staring at the outlet, the idea came to him. The charger needed electricity, but it didn't need it all the time. If he could control the flow of power, he could make Karen's secret visits useless. She would think she was charging her golf cart, but in reality, the outlet would cut off after a short while. His electricity would be protected, and she would be left confused without knowing exactly what had changed. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like the perfect solution. The very next day, John drove into town and stopped at the hardware store. He wandered through the aisles until he found exactly what he was looking for, a simple timer switch that could be connected to an outlet. He smiled to himself as he placed it in his basket. It wasn't expensive, and it wasn't complicated. It was the kind of quiet trick that suited him well, so nobody would know it was there except him. Back home, he spent the evening carefully installing the timer inside the shed. He connected it to the outlet, tested it with one of his tools, and watched with satisfaction as the power shut off exactly an hour later. It worked perfectly. If Karen came again, her golf cart would start charging. The little green light would blink happily for a while, but then without warning, it would stop. She would never know why. That night, John sat on his porch, sipping tea and watching the darkened yard. He felt a strange excitement, almost like a child waiting to see if a trap would work. Didn't want to harm her cart, didn't want to break anything. But he did want her to realize that sneaking around wasn't going to get her anywhere. Sure enough, only a few nights later, he heard the familiar soft roll of tires on gravel. He stayed hidden behind his curtain as Karen parked her golf cart by the shed. She moved quickly, like always, plugging in the charger without hesitation. Then she slipped away into the night, probably thinking she had gotten away with it once again. John chuckled quietly to himself. He glanced at the clock on his wall and waited for the first hour. He knew her cart was charging. But as the timer clicked off, the electricity stopped flowing. The green light on the charger must have gone dark, leaving her cart no better off than before. John could almost picture the confusion on her face the next day when she tried to use it. The following afternoon, as he watered his plants, he heard the sputtering sound of Karen's golf cart coming down the road. It moved slower than usual, like it was struggling. She looked annoyed, tapping the side of the wheel as if urging it to go faster. When she pulled into her driveway, John couldn't help but notice the frustration written all over her face. That evening, she approached him across the fence with a forced smile. "Hey, John," she said casually, though her tone was strained. "You haven't had any problems with your power lately, have you?" John set down his watering can and pretended to think. "No, not really. Why do you ask?" Karen frowned. "It's nothing. My cart keeps running out of charge faster than it should. I plug it in, but it never seems to last long anymore. Must be something wrong with the battery." John nodded sympathetically, hiding his amusement. "Could be. Those batteries don't last forever?" She sighed, clearly frustrated, but she didn't mention the shed. She couldn't. To do so would mean admitting she had been using his outlet again, and she wasn't about to confess that. Instead, she muttered something about maybe needing to take it to a shop and walked back toward her house. John watched her go, feeling a quiet triumph. His plan was working. She could sneak into his shed as much as she wanted, but it wouldn't get her anywhere. The cart would never get a full charge from his power. Slowly, he hoped she would realize it wasn't worth the trouble. Over the next week, the pattern repeated itself. At night, John would sometimes hear her golf cart outside. He knew she was plugging it in, confident that she was outsmarting him. But the timer clicked off every time, leaving her cart half-charged at best. In the mornings, he noticed her driving slower, her expression darker. She even started avoiding eye contact with him, as though embarrassed or suspicious. One afternoon, as John worked on fixing a loose board on his fence, he overheard her talking on the phone. She was pacing in her yard, her voice sharp and annoyed. "I don't get it," she was saying. "Plug it in for hours, but it never holds. It's like the power cuts off on its own. It's maybe the charger's faulty, or maybe the cart's just old." Her words made John grin behind the fence. She had no idea. Still, John kept his composure whenever he saw her. If she waved, he waved back politely. If she tried to start small talk, he responded calmly. He gave no hint that he knew what she was doing or that he had outsmarted her. It was his little secret, and the best part was that it required no effort from him anymore. The timer did all the work. Weeks passed, and gradually John noticed her golf cart parked more often in her driveway during the day. She seemed to be using it less, as though it wasn't reliable anymore. Sometimes he saw her walking instead, carrying her grocery bags by hand instead of driving the cart. Other neighbors probably thought her cart was just breaking down with age, but John knew the truth. His clever trick had quietly forced her to stop relying on his electricity. One evening, as he sat outside watching the sun dip below the trees, John felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't argued, he hadn't made a scene. He had simply set a boundary in a quiet, clever way. Karen had learned her lesson, even if she would never admit it out loud. For the first time in weeks, John felt his property was truly his again. The shed was no longer a place of irritation, but once more his private workshop, untouched by sneaky hands. He had outwitted Karen without a single angry word, and the balance of peace had returned. Days went by after the confrontation, and John tried to convince himself that Karen would keep her word. He wanted to believe she had finally understood his point and would stop taking advantage of him. For a while, things seemed quiet. The shed remained untouched, the extension cord stayed neatly coiled on the shelf, and he didn't hear the late-night hum of her charger. John felt a small wave of relief, thinking maybe she had realized her mistake, but that peace didn't last. One morning, when he went to the shed to grab his toolbox, he noticed the door was slightly ajar. He was sure he had closed it tightly the night before. A strange feeling prickled at the back of his neck. Slowly, he stepped inside, and his eyes went straight to the outlet. The cord was dangling loosely again, stretched across the floor. The plug was still warm, Crouched down, pressing his fingers against it, and knew instantly that someone had been there recently. His stomach tightened. Karen had ignored his warning. After all that talk, after pretending to agree, she had gone right back to doing the same thing. The nerve of it made his hands clench. She hadn't even tried to hide it properly. She must have assumed he wouldn't. Check. Or maybe she thought he was too soft to do anything about it. That evening, John decided to test his suspicion. He kept the lights in his house dim, sat quietly near the window, and waited. Hours ticked by, the night growing colder, until at last he saw the familiar shape of Karen's golf cart rolling slowly down the lane. His pulse quickened. She stopped. Near his shed like she always did, moving quickly and confidently, as though she had every right to be there. John watched her open the shed door, drag the cord across the floor, and plug in her cart without even glancing around. She didn't hesitate, didn't sneak she, just did it, calm as you please. He stayed hidden, watching. The anger in him was stronger this time. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had chosen to ignore him. His earlier kindness, his attempt at a peaceful warning, had meant nothing to her. She was determined to take what she wanted no matter what he said. The next morning, John's mood was heavy. Over breakfast, he stared at his coffee and thought about what had happened. He had lived in this town long enough to know that fighting with neighbors could ruin the peace for everyone. He didn't want shouting matches, didn't want police visits, didn't want gossip spreading. But he also couldn't let this continue. It wasn't about electricity anymore. It was about respect. Karen had shown him she had none for his boundaries. For a moment, John considered walking straight over to her house and confronting her again. He imagined the conversation, her dismissive laugh, her excuses, her mocking tone. It made his blood boil. He knew she would twist the situation, try to make him look unreasonable. He had already seen how she acted the last time. Talking again would only lead to more of the same. Another idea crossed his mind, locking the shed completely. He could buy a sturdy padlock and chain it shut. That would stop her from getting in, at least for now. But then he thought of her reaction. Someone like Karen wouldn't just shrug and walk away. She might complain to the other neighbors, spreading rumors about him being stingy or unfriendly. Worse, she might try to break the lock or find another sneaky way around it. A lock would be a temporary barrier, not a real solution. John sighed and rubbed his forehead. He wanted a way to stop her without escalating the situation into open war. He didn't want to be the villain in the neighborhood, but he also didn't want to be the fool she kept walking over. It was a difficult balance, and he wasn't sure what the right step was yet. Later that week, as he returned from the grocery store, John noticed the shed door slightly open again. His bags nearly slipped from his hands. It was happening more. Often now, Karen was not even trying to hide it. She seemed to think she had one, that she could do whatever she pleased. He walked inside and found the extension cord stretched across the floor, just as before. He unplugged it sharply and coiled it back, his movement stiff with frustration. That night as he lay in bed, sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept replaying the same thought. She was never going to stop on her own. He had given her the chance. He had confronted her politely, explained himself clearly, even trusted her word afterward. And still, she had chosen to ignore it all. The situation had become more than just an annoyance. It was now a test of his patience, of his ability to stand up for himself. The next evening, John went for a walk around the block to clear his head. As he passed by Karen's house, he noticed her golf cart parked in the driveway. The sight made him shake his head. She had a big house with a spacious garage, surely equipped with her own outlets. There was no reason for her to use his, except laziness or entitlement. She wanted convenience at his expense. That thought hardened something in him. Back at home, John stood in front of his shed, staring at the wooden door. He realized that continuing like this would only drive him crazy. If he wanted peace, he needed to be clever. Didn't want to start a fight he couldn't win, but he also didn't want to give in. There had to be a way to handle it that would teach her a lesson without dragging him into constant conflict. That night, as the wind rattled the branches outside, John sat at his kitchen table with a notepad. He scribbled ideas crossing them. Out one by one, Call the police? Too extreme. Put up a fence around the shed. Too expensive. Install cameras and catch her in the act. Possible, but what then? He didn't want to spend his days arguing over recordings. He tapped the pen against the page, his mind searching for something different, something subtle, something that would stop her in her tracks while keeping him out of direct confrontation. As the minutes stretched on, a small smile began to form at the corner of his lips. A plan was starting to take shape, something clever, something that wouldn't involve shouting or fighting, but would quietly make her realize she couldn't keep taking advantage of him. For now, he didn't move on it. He simply folded the paper, tucked it into his drawer, and went to bed with the faintest spark of satisfaction. He knew he had the power to turn the situation around. And the next time Karen tried to sneak into his shed, she was in for a surprise. John could not keep the matter to himself forever. Every time he saw Karen drive past his house in that golf cart, he felt his patience thinning. He knew he could not let her continue using his shed as her personal charging station. A confrontational man by nature, but even the calmest person has a limit. After a week of quietly observing her sneaky trips, he decided enough was enough. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky glowed orange, John noticed Karen once again rolling her golf cart toward his property. She stopped near the shed with the same casual attitude, like someone watering their plants or taking a stroll. She pulled the door slightly open, bent down, and plugged in her charger. Her movements were smooth, practiced, as if she had done this dozens of times without a second thought. That was when John stepped out of his house. His boots crunched on the gravel as he walked toward her, and Karen, startled, quickly turned around. "Oh, John," she said, her voice sweet, pretending. "Surprised, didn't see you there." John stopped a few steps away, his face calm but his eyes steady. "Karen, what are you doing in my shed?" She blinked innocently and gave a little laugh. "Oh, this. Just plugging in the cart for a bit. You don't mind, do you? It's just a tiny bit of power. It's barely noticeable." That response made John's jaw tighten. He had expected some excuse, maybe even an apology. But instead, she brushed it off as if she had every right to take his electricity. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Karen, this is my property. That outlet is connected to my meter, and I pay for the electricity. You can't just come in here and use it without asking me." Karen folded her arms and tilted, her head as though she were the one being inconvenienced. "Oh, come on, John, don't be so dramatic. It's not like I'm draining your whole house. It's just my little golf cart. You probably won't even notice it on your bill." John's calmness began to slip. "That's not the point. It doesn't matter if it cost me $1 or $100. You didn't ask. You just walked into my shed like it belonged to you. That's not okay." Her smile faded a little, but she quickly replaced it with a scoff. "Honestly, I thought you were the kind of neighbor who wouldn't mind helping out. Everyone shares around here. You borrow sugar, eggs, tools. What's the difference with electricity?" John shook his head. "The difference is that people ask before borrowing those things, and they return them. You didn't ask me. You just helped yourself repeatedly." His voice grew firmer. "This has to stop." For a moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the faint hum of the charger. Karen looked at him with narrowed eyes, clearly not used to being challenged. Then she shrugged dramatically. "Fine if it bothers you so much. I won't use it anymore." John stared at her for a long second, trying to read her expression. Her words sounded like agreement, but her tone was filled with sarcasm. It didn't feel sincere, and he had the uneasy sense she wasn't truly going to stop. Still, he gave her the benefit of the doubt. "Thank you," he said firmly. "I appreciate that." Karen tugged the charger out of the outlet and pushed it back into her cart with a snap. She climbed onto the seat, muttering under her breath, and drove away with a sharp turn of the wheels. Dust rose from the path as she disappeared toward her driveway. John stood there, watching the shed door swing slightly in the breeze. He felt a mix of relief and unease. He had confronted her, spoken his mind, and made it clear she was crossing a line. But something about her attitude unsettled him. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't even admitted she was wrong. Instead, She acted like he was the unreasonable one for not letting her use his power. That night, John sat at his kitchen table, sipping tea, but he could not shake the conversation from his mind. He replayed her words, the way she had shrugged, the mockery in her voice. It gnawed at him. He knew people like Karen, people who thought rules were for others, not for them. People who twisted situations until they became the victim, no matter how much they were in the wrong. A few days passed, and John watched closely. During the daylight, Karen behaved as though nothing had happened. She waved when she saw him outside, her smile bright and wide, as though their confrontation had never occurred. But John noticed little things. Once when he was raking leaves, he saw her glance toward his shed, her eyes narrowing for a second before she quickly looked away. Another time, he heard the faint roll of her golf cart tires late at night, though he couldn't see clearly if she had stopped near his shed. The doubt grew stronger. Wondered if she had actually listened to him, or if she was simply waiting for him to lower his guard. John thought about putting a new lock on the shed, but part of him wanted to believe she would respect his words. He had been polite yet firm, clear in his boundaries. Surely that would be enough. But deep down, he knew it probably wasn't. What bothered him most wasn't the electricity bill or the charger. It was her attitude. It's the way she had acted offended, as though he had wronged her by pointing out the truth. That sense of entitlement hung heavy in his mind, like a dark cloud waiting to burst. He had lived in that neighborhood for years, and most of the neighbors were respectful and kind. But Karen was different. She didn't seem to see boundaries the way others did. One evening, as he was trimming the hedges near his fence, Karen came strolling over with a forced cheerfulness. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" she said, leaning casually on the fence. John nodded stiffly. "It is, she continued. "I was thinking about what you said the other day. I didn't mean to upset you. I just figured, well, you've got plenty of outlets, and my cart really doesn't take much. I thought we could be neighborly, She gave a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. John set down his trimmer and faced her squarely. "Being neighborly doesn't mean taking without asking. If you needed something, you could have just come and knocked on my door. I probably would have said yes. But instead, you snuck in. That's what makes it wrong." Karen pursed her lips, clearly not liking his firm tone. "I guess some people are stricter about these things than others." She rolled her eyes slightly, then straightened up. "Well, don't worry. I won't trouble your precious shed again." With that, she turned and walked away, her steps sharp and annoyed. John watched her go, the uneasy feeling in his chest growing heavier. He had made himself clear, but he didn't believe her. He could see it in her body language, the way she tossed her words like knives. This wasn't the end of it that night. As he locked the shed door for the first time in weeks, John realized something important. Confronting Karen had been necessary, but it wasn't enough. She wasn't the type to accept correction gracefully. If anything, his words had only challenged her stubborn pride. John could sense it. This little conflict between them was far from over. John lived in a small, quiet town where everyone mostly minded their own business. He liked it that way. His house sat on the edge of the neighborhood, with a bit of land around it, and at the back of the property stood an old wooden shed. That shed was special to him, not because it was fancy, but because he had fixed it up with his own hands. He used it to keep his tools safe, store his lawn equipment, and sometimes even to do little repair projects when he had free time. It was his private space, a place where he felt calm. One morning, John stepped outside with his cup of coffee and walked toward the shed. The sun was just rising, and everything felt peaceful. But when he opened the shed door, he noticed something odd. The extension cord that normally lay coiled on the shelf was stretched out across the floor. He frowned and followed the cord with his eyes until he saw it plugged firmly into the wall socket. The outlet light was glowing, showing that electricity was running through it. That was strange because John hadn't used the outlet the night before. For a moment, he wondered if he had simply forgotten to unplug something. But when he checked, the other end of the cord was loose, hanging down as if it had been recently disconnected. He shrugged it off at first, telling himself it was nothing. Maybe he had used it earlier in the week and forgotten. But over the next few days, he began to notice little things that didn't add up. His electricity bill seemed a little higher than normal, even though he hadn't been using much power. The outlet in the shed felt slightly warm, as if something had been running on it for hours. Once, when he went to grab a wrench, he noticed a faint rubber mark on the floor that looked like tire tracks. That made him stop and stare. Tire tracks in his shed? He didn't own anything with small tires except his wheelbarrow, and that didn't leave marks like these. The mystery sat heavy in his mind, and he became more alert. John was a patient man, but he didn't like puzzles that involved his own property. One afternoon, as he sat on his porch, he heard a faint humming sound coming from the direction of the shed. It wasn't loud, just a steady low noise, like a machine running. Curious, he walked quietly toward the shed, careful not to make his steps too obvious. When he reached the corner of the building, he peeked around and froze. There, right outside his shed, was his neighbor Karen's golf cart. It was parked close, with its charging cable snaked inside his shed through the slightly open door. His eyes followed the cable, and sure enough, it was plugged into his outlet. His mouth tightened, and he felt his heart pick up speed. Karen had been sneaking onto his property, using his electricity to charge her golf cart without asking. He didn't say anything right then, simply stood there, hidden behind the corner, watching as the little green light on her charger blinked steadily. The situation irritated him, but at the same time, he felt a strange sense of disbelief. Who just helped themselves to someone else's power like that? It wasn't as if electricity was free. He worked hard to pay his bills, and here she was, quietly adding to them, without so much as a word. That evening, when the sun had gone down, he walked back out to the shed with a flashlight. The golf cart was gone, but the faint smell of heated plastic lingered near the outlet. He touched the plug, and it was still warm. He knew for certain now that it hadn't been his imagination. Karen had been doing this more than once. She must have been sneaking over, plugging in her cart, and then returning later to collect it. John couldn't shake the feeling of intrusion. His shed wasn't just a building, it was part of his personal space. He had built shelves in there with his own hands, painted the inside walls, and even installed a proper lock on the door. But lately he had been leaving it unlatched, thinking no one would bother. Now he realized how wrong he had been. Karen had taken advantage of that trust, slipping in and out without caring how it might affect him. The next morning, John tried to go about his usual routine, but his mind kept circling back to the image of that golf cart sitting beside his shed. He replayed it over and over, each time feeling the same mix of anger and disbelief. It wasn't just about the money, though the thought of paying for someone else's electricity bothered him. It was about the principle. It was about respect. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that property lines mattered. People might borrow sugar or wave across the fence, but nobody just walked into someone's shed and used it as their own. Later that day, he watched Karen drive past his house on the golf cart. She waved cheerfully, as if nothing had happened. Her smile made John clench his jaw. He wondered if she thought he was too polite, too quiet, too unlikely to notice what she was doing. Maybe she assumed he wouldn't care. Maybe she thought it was such a small thing that it didn't matter. But to John, it mattered a great deal. He started paying closer attention. He began to look out his window at odd hours, just to see if she was sneaking back. And sure enough, 2 nights later, when the moon was high, he spotted her shadow moving near the shed.
Ow.
He didn't rush out or call to her, simply watched as she pulled her golf cart into place, opened his shed door like she owned it, and plugged in the charger. The quiet click of the plug sliding into the outlet echoed in his ears, even from a distance. She didn't even look around, as though she was confident she wouldn't be caught. Standing at his window, John felt a wave of frustration, but also a strange calm. Now he knew the truth without a doubt. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a one-time mistake. Karen had been deliberately using his power again and again without asking. He rubbed his forehead, trying to decide what to do next. He wasn't the type to explode in anger, but he also wasn't someone who let people walk over him. Over the next days, John kept turning the problem over in his mind. He thought about walking straight over to Karen's house and confronting her, He thought about putting a padlock on the shed, making it impossible for her to sneak in. But deep down, he wanted to handle it in a way that wouldn't lead to shouting matches across the fence. He wanted to be smart about it. For now, though, he simply carried the knowledge, waiting for the right time to act. The peace of his mornings had been disturbed, and every time he saw his shed, he thought of Karen's quiet theft. It was no longer just a place for tools and projects. It had become the stage of a secret drama between him and his neighbor, a drama that was only beginning.